Black Widow has finally released in theaters and on Disney Plus. It only took about a year of it being delayed. I just finished watching it, which means it's time to do my review and give my thoughts on this movie overall. Now, as you guys probably know, I like to do this for a lot of different Marvel, Star Wars, and even DC projects. I was covering Bad Batch and Loki weekly. I know I haven't been able to keep up with that for the past couple of weeks. I do apologize for that. Life just gets pretty busy sometimes. There's been a lot going on with Loki, not so much with the Bad Batch, but I will have those weekly review and thoughts videos going back up next week. Anyways, enough about that. Let's talk about Black Widow. So this video is going to be done in two different parts. The first entire section is going to be non-spoiler, so if you guys haven't seen the movie yet, that's completely okay. I'll just give you my overall thoughts and what I think about the movie. And then later on in the video, we'll be discussing a bunch of spoilers, but I'll give you a warning before that happens. And if you guys would like to skip to that, I'll leave a timestamp in the description down below. So, what did I think of this movie? I thought it wasn't that great, but it isn't bad at all either. Like, if I had to rate it, I'd give it like a 6.5 or a 7 out of 10. So not a bad movie, it was enjoyable, it was a good time, it just wasn't anything great. This was kind of Marvel's first attempt at a spy movie, unless you want to consider Civil War a spy movie as well. And I think that's pretty neat to see just because Marvel is branching out into so many different genres. We have comedies, some romance stuff, some teen dramas, and overall just a bunch of different genres within this one Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I think that's a great thing because it allows the MCU to be so much more accessible to different types of people. Now, as a spy movie, I wouldn't say it is that great of a spy movie. It definitely feels like it takes inspiration off of other spy films like Jason Bourne or even James Bond at some times. But this movie just has a very predictable plot, even though it's not that bad. It just feels like a very typical Marvel storyline. Like when somebody describes a Marvel movie, this is pretty much it. You get some pretty decent action, very likable characters with a bunch of witty banter, and then a very bad villain. And that's pretty much what this movie is. Nat interacting with her family and other side characters was definitely the highlight of this movie, especially Florence Pugh as Elena. She was great. I also love David Harbour as the Red Guardian. I thought he provided some really nice comedic relief. And it's just weird seeing Nat at the forefront of a Marvel movie because we've never seen that before in the MCU. Like, she's only ever been a side character in other people's movies like Iron Man, Captain America, and the Avengers, but now the entire story is focused on her, which is great to see. But even with that, the plot in this movie definitely takes a backseat to the characters. They definitely steal the spotlight here, which is pretty typical for a Marvel movie. Now, one big issue with this movie is the villain, and this is something that's a problem in a lot of different Marvel movies. A lot of the time in Marvel films, we have a villain who just isn't that fleshed out, and we can't really relate to that well, which ends up kind of taking away your interest in the overall plot. Like, Taskmaster was okay, don't get me wrong, he wasn't bad or anything. I don't know what he's like in the comics at all, but I did kind of enjoy his story arc here. I just thought it could have been much better, to be honest, and we'll talk about that in the spoilers. The fight scenes in this movie and choreography were better than most Marvel movies, just because it's a lot of hand-to-hand combat stuff, and when that's going to be the focus of your action scenes, Marvel typically does a very good job with that. Like looking back at the Falcon and Winter Soldier, or even some of the Captain America movies, the fight scenes are really great in those movies, which is also the reason why I'm super excited for Shang-Chi as well. I think that movie is going to have the best fight scenes in the entire MCU. Anyways, I'm getting kind of sidetracked. The CGI in Black Widow was okay, but it did start to look very bad in some scenes, especially at the ending. I don't know what happened there. The CGI was just really good throughout the entire film, and then for some reason at the ending, it just looked very bad. And I don't think that has to do with COVID or any of the delays this movie faced, because this movie was completed before COVID actually hit. So I'm not sure why the CGI looked bad, it just looked very off compared to most Marvel movies, which typically do a very good job with CGI. So that was a little bit immersion breaking, but it wasn't too bad or anything. The soundtrack in this movie was a little bit forgettable, to be honest. I was kind of hoping it would sound a lot more like the songs that were used in the trailers. The themes that were used in the trailers just felt a lot more unique, and it felt like they matched Black Widow's characters so much better. Like, I can't really remember any song that was playing during the Black Widow movie. The soundtrack was just very forgettable. And the overall kind of flaw with this movie, I guess if you want to call it a flaw, it's not really a flaw, but it's just something that kind of takes away from the experience, is the fact that this is a movie that nobody asked for. Like, don't get me wrong, a lot of people wanted a Black Widow movie, myself included, but not one set between Civil War and Infinity War. Like, this is a time frame that didn't really need to be fleshed out, especially for Black Widow's character. Like, yes, we knew she was on the run, she was hiding from the government, but just having this a large story arc of her and her family feels very out of place. And that is something that was bothering me the entire time that I was watching this movie. It feels like this movie came out way too late, especially since the character has been dead since 2019. Like, yeah, the movie did get delayed, but this type of story, one that was based around Black Widow, should have came out years before Endgame. Like, it definitely feels like it was shoehorned into the MCU storyline. I don't think the writers for Endgame really had any idea this movie was going to exist. or any other MCU film for that matter, it just feels very out of place. And also, this movie doesn't really connect to the larger MCU at all. It's very grounded and self-contained, which isn't even a bad thing. Like, it was almost refreshing seeing a Marvel movie that wasn't interconnected into all these other Marvel projects. It almost reminded me of Iron Man 1 a little bit. It was completely self-contained, and I knew it wasn't really going to connect to any other parts of the MCU. Like, I think aside from the after credits scene, I don't think this movie really does anything to tease or set up another film, which obviously it can't because Black Widow is dead. And that's one major reason why this movie really should have came out before Endgame. Also, it felt like this film had a lot of different references to past events that we didn't know about. Like, it feels like this is Black Widow 2, and a bunch of events happened before that we didn't get to see in Black Widow 1. So ultimately, it feels like Marvel kind of regrets not making a solo Black Widow movie, and then they just kind of gave us this instead of giving us multiple films like they did for other characters. So overall, it wasn't really bad. It was very enjoyable. I know it sounds like I'm ragging on it a lot here, but trust me, I actually did enjoy the movie quite a bit. But I still do feel like it's the worst thing that Marvel has made this year. The TV series have been much better than this. But yeah, those are pretty much my spoiler-free thoughts on Black Widow. So now let's go ahead and get into these spoilers. So if you guys haven't seen Black Widow yet, make sure to go watch the movie first, then come back here. Alright, so there it is. That's your spoiler warning. Let's go ahead and talk spoilers. Now, this is going to feel like a very minor thing, but I really want to talk about that opening credit scene. That was completely awesome. Marvel movies typically don't do this. They get right into the action and the credits are usually left to the end. But Black Widow here had this long opening credit scene and I absolutely loved it. It felt very reminiscent of other spy movies like Jason Bourne. And it was also very dark and gritty and just kind of set the tone for this entire film. Although the rest of the movie did kind of contradict this and ended up being a little bit more lighthearted. Like, I still think the first 30 minutes or so of this movie were the best parts of this film, and it kind of just went down from there and became a little bit too generic and a little bit too predictable. But seeing Nat grow up as a spy in the US was probably the most interesting part of this movie. Anyways, the real problem here is that the villain sucked. Like, I don't even remember the character's name, but he's this typical bad guy doing evil things that is never really fleshed out. Like, I don't mean Taskmaster, I mean the Russian guy that runs the Red Room. This guy is just evil because he's evil. And I guess he just wants to take over the world and rule it or something. He's just a very typical Marvel villain that's doing evil things for evil's sake. And yeah, this is an ongoing problem with a lot of solo Marvel movies, but I guess I just kind of forgot about them since we haven't seen a solo Marvel film in a little while. Anyways, one of the things that kept throwing me off this entire film was the fact that Nat talks a lot about this villain and they clearly have a long history, but we never got to see that. Like, remember earlier in the non-spoiler section when I was talking about the fact that this movie feels like a sequel to a movie that doesn't exist? Well, that is pretty much why. We keep getting references to Budapest and Hawkeye and growing up in the Red Room due to this villain, but we never get to see any of that. They only talk about it, and it kind of feels like they expect us to have some type of hatred or dislike toward this character, but we've never seen him before, so he doesn't really have that much presence on screen. Anyways, we also have the Taskmaster here, which I was actually kind of surprised with. She seemed pretty dope. She was kind of like a representation of Nat's past sins, and that was a theme that this movie was trying to go into quite a bit, the fact that Nat was trying to make up for her past mistakes. And Taskmaster here is just a physical representation of all of that. So I like the direction they went with Taskmaster. It's just the thing is that we don't get to know her at all, so she felt very uninteresting as a villain overall. Like, I think they should have had Nat interact with this little girl at some point when she was in the Red Room, and that way they could draw parallels between her and Elena, almost like two younger sisters to Nat going down different paths. Like, one is good and one is evil, and both are mistakes from Nat's past. I think that would have made Taskmaster a much better villain and would have fleshed her out a little bit more. Anyways, another thing that bugged me was the fact that this movie feels like it clashes with Endgame a little bit. Like, it really should have been released before Infinity War and Endgame, or maybe even in between Infinity War and Endgame. I think that still would have worked. But this movie just doesn't really work well with Endgame at all. Like, one thing that kept sticking out to me was the conversation that Nat and Cap have in the beginning of Endgame. She talks about being alone and the fact that the Avengers are pretty much the only family that she's ever had. Like, she keeps talking about the fact that this job is all she has, and she sacrifices herself to save pretty much the only people that she's ever loved. But now it turns out that she kind of had a family there as well, people that she cared about, so that feels like it didn't really line up all that well. I mean, I guess they could have been snapped away in that moment by Thanos as well, but still, it just feels like she had no recollection of them, she felt alone, and was only really recalling the Avengers, which doesn't really add up with this movie. Also, one minor thing, I would have loved to see Red Guardian interact with Steve Rogers in some way, but obviously that can't happen. So that's kind of a missed opportunity as well, but if this movie came out before Endgame, all of these issues would have been fixed. Anyways, there's not really that much for me to spoil in this movie. There is one big thing though, and that is the end credit scene. I think this end credit scene was pretty much the most interesting part of this entire movie, and that is not really a good thing. It was still a super cool end credit scene though. We got to see the return of Valentina, and it turns out that Elena blames Hawkeye for Nat's death, and I guess she's now going to be hunting him. And that's a super awesome story arc to set up. She's definitely going to be showing up in the Hawkeye TV series, probably as like a temporary villain for the first few episodes. But I think that's completely awesome. I really liked Elena in this movie. She definitely stood out and was a very likable character, so having her return is great to see. I really do like that the Disney Plus shows and the movies are all being connected together. I wasn't really expecting it to happen this early on, but I'm glad to see it. Captain America 4 will be a sequel to the Falcon and Winter Soldier. Black Widow will connect to Hawkeye pretty heavily with Elena. And I guess Valentina is becoming the connective tissue between all the more realistic and grounded Marvel storylines. This is something that I think is a great idea. It's almost like we have a smaller MCU within the MCU that is more focused on grounded and realistic Marvel stories. Like, we have all the crazy stuff going up in space and all the more overpowered stuff with WandaVision and Loki and all that type of stuff. And then there's the more realistic stuff like the Falcon and Winter Soldier, Captain America 4, Hawkeye, and now Black Widow. And all these movies are going to be kind of loosely connected and hopefully culminate into a bigger event. And I think that's a great idea because it kind of feels weird having these underpowered human characters taking on larger forces like Kang or something. I think that would feel a little bit weird, so having more grounded and Earth-based storylines is a welcome addition to me. As you guys know, I absolutely love the Falcon and Winter Soldier just because of how grounded and realistic it was, so having more storylines like that is a great thing. But yeah, that was a super awesome end credit scene. I can't wait to see Elena show up in Hawkeye. And I think that pretty much wraps it up for my spoiler thoughts on Black Widow. So overall, it's a decent Marvel movie that feels pretty forgettable and out of place in the current MCU, but it's still a very enjoyable film. But those are pretty much my thoughts on Black Widow, guys. Before you head out, make sure to go down in the comments below and let me know what you guys thought about the movie. Did you guys enjoy it? What was your favorite part? And what role do you think Elena is going to play in Hawkeye? Whatever you're thinking, guys, anything and everything, make sure to leave it down in the comments below. But that will pretty much do for me, guys. Again, thank you all so much for watching, and I will catch you all in the next one. Peace.